Welcome to Grain IQ. I'm Chad Moyer. Grain IQ is a joint production of the Nebraska Rural Radio Association along with sponsorship of the Nebraska Soybean Board. And we thank them for helping us bring you these Grain IQ podcasts. Now, if you remember to the last Grain IQ podcast we did, it was part of the Pro Farmer Crop Tour. And we were in Nebraska City where we had an opportunity to sit down and visit with the Western leg, the guy who was in charge of the Western leg, Chip Flory. He sat down and we talked about what was going on with the Western leg of the Pro Farmer Crop Tour. And today's guest on the Grain IQ program, a gal by the name of Bree Baatz. She is a grain and oilseed analyst with Terrain, and she happened to be on the Pro Farmer Crop Tour as well. And we're going to talk about her experiences with that and things of that nature, and then also get a feel of where we're at with the markets right now, what's the feeling as combines are really starting to roll across some corn and soybean production areas, and then some take-home ideas as well. What are some of the things that you should be thinking about with your marketing plan? Bree, thanks so much for sitting down and visiting with us today. Tell me a little bit about Terrain, your job with Terrain as a grain and oilseed analyst. What is your job there, and how do you contribute to the work of Terrain?
Yeah, so Terrain has been around for about 3 years at this point. We were stood up by two leading farm credit associations that are in my little tag up here. So FCSA, Farm Credit Services of America, is based out of Omaha, and then American Ag Credit. They basically wanted to have a joint partnership of economists and analysts to provide a value-added service to their farm credit customers on actionable insights. And so what our team focuses on is more longer-term market impacts. We do quarterly outlooks, but we'll also do public engagements. We'll do speaking engagements both at industry-related conferences and to our farm credit existing and prospective customers, just to provide the longer-term actionable insights for them to make better on-farm decisions. And so we cover all different commodities. So in American Ag Credit's territory, there's wine and specialty crops, and then a lot of dairy that hits both of those associations, beef, swine, poultry. Myself and Mark Rosenbaum is my colleague. We handle the grain and oilseed complex. Since the team was founded 3 years ago, we've had several other associations come into the fold. So Farm Credit in New Mexico merged with American Ag Credit, and Ag Country up in the northern Dakotas and Minnesota has a partnership with FCSA as well. And so we just continue to expand kind of our insight portfolio to other farm credits as well. But we realize farmers are very busy and have a lot on their plate, and we're basically just a value-added offering for them.
Well, let's jump right into it. Based on what you've been able to collect so far and kind of the situation right now, what would you say is driving grain prices right now? Is there one big thing? Is it a whole bunch of small things? What seems to be kind of pushing grain markets right now, not only locally or domestically, but globally?
Yeah. So when I look at these markets, it's helpful to kind of break everything down into bite-sized pieces. So when we look at the supply side of the balance sheet, we actually have kind of a friendly story developing. We did see overall soybean supply come down due to less planted acres. USDA is still expecting a record yield, and Nebraska's part of that. So when you look at the state specifically, yield is forecast at 61 bushels per acre. That's an increase of 7% year over year. But when you combine that with the reduced acres planted, total production for the new crop year is going to be down about 1.5% year over year. And so that's friendly, the market. And then we've also seen domestic stocks come down as well. They're down about 10% year over year. And so the supply side of the balance sheet is actually shaping up to be pretty friendly. But what's pressuring the market and has been pressuring the market for quite some time is persistent global production, primarily led by Brazil. And that's probably not going to go away anytime soon. And so we need to do everything we can here in the United States to find domestic outlets for our markets. And Nebraska has a really friendly story on the demand side as well, with a lot of that new crush capacity coming online in our state.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Let's expand on that a little bit more because I do get the feeling there is some biofuel uncertainty out there, even though we do have. One new crush plant is at full capacity. Another new crush plant is ramping up as we're talking about this. But there is still, I get the feeling there's still some biofuel uncertainty out there, huh?
There certainly is. So what I would say is earlier this summer, there was a lot of positive momentum in the biofuel space. We had the Environmental Protection Agency come out in the middle of June with proposed renewable volume obligations. And the biggest surprise for the market, there was two key things. One was the increase in the blend proposals. It was more than what the industry was asking for, and it was more than double what we have in place for 2025. It was going to exceed 5 billion gallons in 2026. The other piece was the prioritization of domestic feedstocks for the RIN credit values. And so what that was going to do is give domestic feedstocks like soybean oil 100% of the RIN value, and then discredit, if you will, imported substitutes for biofuel production, like used cooking oil from China, canola oil from Canada. They would only get 50% of that tax credit. And so everybody was very excited about that. A few weeks later, you get the One Big Beautiful Bill implemented, and there was 45Z, which is the dollar per gallon tax credit for biofuels. We got some clarity that that program was going to continue under the Trump administration. Up to that point, there was a lot of concern that it wouldn't. And then two, that it was going to be extended through 2029. And so everybody's really excited in the summer. Well, as we sit here today, there's not been more traction that's been taking place in that space. And so we're kind of in this holding pattern, waiting for additional clarity and guidance, because the One Big Beautiful Bill kind of just gave us those two things: that one, the program was going to exist and it was going to be extended, but there's a lot of work to be done between USDA, the Department of Treasury, IRS, and then this EPA RVO announcement. And so if they meet their deadline, their deadline was supposed to have this announcement at the end of October. If that happens, that'll be a pricing opportunity. I imagine that'll be very friendly to the market, but there's speculation that they're probably not going to get their homework done on time, and the can might get kicked down the road into 2026.
Yeah. And if history is any indication, there's probably a fairly good chance that would happen. That's just my opinion, but I mean, just putting all the cards on the table, right? Now, I started by at the introduction, I said, yeah, you were on the Pro Farmer Crop Tour. We interviewed Chip Flory in the last podcast. Just a quick side tangent. First time on the Pro Farmer Crop Tour for you, Bree.
Yes.
How was that experience for you?
It was great. I definitely learned a lot because I'm a city kid, even though I'm a Nebraska native. I did not grow up on a corner soybean farm. So it was great to be in the fields and with more senior scouts to see, what are they looking for as you walk a soybean field or a cornfield to gauge yield prospects. And so we started in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It was very wet, as you know, being a Nebraska native as well, that we've had a lot of moisture this summer, like way more precipitation than what we seasonally experience in other summers. It's usually hot and dry in July. And it was very wet and muddy, and the fields looked really good in South Dakota because of that. And same with kind of upper central Nebraska. What was interesting is as we moved from Grand Island over to Nebraska City, we started to see a little bit more pest pressure, which could shave off some yields. But certainly once we crossed the Missouri River over into Iowa, a ton of variability. We saw a lot of disease pressure, pests, and I think the Eastern Lake saw the exact same thing. And so that brings a lot of speculation and question and doubt on if these record yields that USDA is currently forecasting for both corn and soybeans are going to be achievable. And I think as we sit here today, now that we have August behind us as well, I think the market's figuring August was the high water mark for USDA's forecast for yields. And that goalpost is likely going to come down, and that'll be a friendlier story as well on the supply side.
So I wonder, is that going to play into harvest basis too? Because like you say, if we've had our biggest yield and everybody was worried about two big crops, a big soybean crop followed by a big corn crop, and the logistics that was going to create, is that different now? Do we think it might be different, or how is basis shaping up, do you think, across our region, across Nebraska and surrounding states?
Yeah, so I would categorize it as transportation is going to be available. And the reason I think that is when you look at secondary freight values for rail in particular and some of their pricing action, they've actually reduced, both BNSF and UP have reduced rail rates. And so that's signaling to me that there's abundant freight out there. And so if product does need to move, it'll move. However, I do think farmers are not going to want to sell at these prices because we know that they're below their cost of production. And so that's understandable. And so I think the challenge we're going to have here around the corner is storage, and it's going to get tight. And so each individual producer at this point is going to have to figure out their cash flow needs. And so what I'm wondering what's going to happen is, are you going to see more corn get sold right off of the combine because it does have a friendlier demand story as we sit right here right now, and then soybeans get stored in hopes of either a trade deal primarily with China and or some biofuel clarity? And so if that happens, then I still don't see transportation being tight to be able to execute that. And there are some pockets, even outside of Nebraska, that basis is starting to firm a little bit. And so I think those that have purchase needs, like your local processors, corn ethanol plants, soybean crushers, they're going to have to bid up to get it out of the farmer's hand too. And so it's going to be kind of this balancing act in the short term.
Yeah. So you kind of hit on it, but I'd like you to expand on it a little bit more. That decision tree about, okay, I'm going to have bushels that are going to go into storage. Is it commercial storage? Is it my storage on the farm? We know there are going to be bushels that have to leave the farm, right? That we don't have storage for. So let's talk about those bushels first. The ones that we know are going to town. What's the decision tree on how we handle that marketing decision? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's going to come down to each individual operator and then obviously what's in your backyard. So thinking Nebraska specifically, if you know you have bushels in the radius of AGP David City, then I mean, I would assume that you'd be able to work out a reasonable price with them to buy your bushels right at harvest. But at the end of the day, the storage situation, it does give farmers a lot of flexibility and more pricing power. And so it's a sticky situation. It's really hard to kind of unpack for everybody what a good recommendation would be because it is such an individual decision. But I just think at these prices, store what you can. Corn does have a friendlier demand story. And if you're tight on storage, I would prioritize storing corn over soybeans because just longer term fundamentals, I think soybeans is going to have a harder time because of the demand side.
Okay. So then let's take it beyond that. So let's say we've got that grain in storage. Okay. What are the keys that you'll be watching for that will influence that decision when to pull the trigger, when to take that grain out and move it into the market? What are the things we should be watching for?
Yeah. So I led the call saying I'm a fundamentalist. So I really am excited and hopeful that we get some of this domestic crush clarity. But both biofuels and trade are dependent on policy, somebody's signature on executing forward guidance here. And so that's difficult and that's hard to market. And so where that leaves us is we really are going to have to watch closely South American weather. Brazil is planting their soybean crop right now. And so while China has all their eggs in the Brazil basket as we sit here today, and even Argentina now, if there's any sort of weather scare through their planting and growing season, I do think that's going to present an opportunity for U.S. soybeans. So if there is a portion that producers store on farm or off farm, there could be opportunity. And I don't think all hope is lost on the export side either. Everyone is focused on China because it does feel like that's kind of the easy solution, because they do take normally half of our exports. But I think if there's a weather scare in South America at all, we're just going to be doing musical chairs here as it relates to both soybeans and the soybean complex, because you have Argentina that crushes a lot of their beans and will export a lot of meal. But as I just hinted to, they've sold a ton of volume to China. And so that'll leave less bean supply available within Argentina to crush. So therefore less meal for them to export. And US has an opportunity to then backfill that with our domestic crush here at home.
Mm-hmm. What are you hearing about the situation in South America right now? Because I've heard expanded acres are coming for this coming planting season, but I've heard it's still a little questionable on the weather. So what's the setup as they're getting into putting seeds in the ground?
Yeah, so Brazil is expected to have record production for old crop, and USDA's forecast an increase of 3.5% for new crop. They do have pasture land that's available to proceed. I think those farmers, though, are dealing with the same challenges U.S. producers are dealing with at these lower prices. It's not as favorable. And then what we're also seeing at the same time, because of this alignment between Brazil and China, their prices have increased quite a bit. And so that's pressuring their domestic crush margins as well as China's crush margins. And so that could influence the pace of future expansion if these two maintain kind of a mutually exclusive relationship like what they're doing right now.
Mm-hmm. All right. Is there anything else? We've talked a lot about China. We talked about South America. Is there anything else globally? We hear try and get updates from Ukraine and trying to wind that down. But is there Australia? Anything else? Anything else you should kind of keep an eye on for direction in these markets?
Yeah, definitely. So as we've talked a little bit about the soybean complex and the byproducts and biofuels influence and domestic crush here at home, especially in Nebraska. Right now, meal is still leading the value to the domestic processors margin on the crush side. And so the bright spot, if you will, as we wait for whole bean trade deals to be executed, has been soybean meal exports. And so we've really seen great demand there. So when I look at old crop sales, we're up 14% versus same time period, third week of September, year over year. And that's been a very positive story. I expect that to continue as we crush more here at home, that the soybean meal export will become the primary focus instead of whole beans. And that's okay, because the world is consuming more protein and soybean meal is a great feed product for that. But at the end of the day, there's not going to be another market the size and scope of China that will replace it. And so if we can right size the supply side of the balance sheet and get some biofuel clarity, then I think we have an opportunity for soybean prices to potentially move higher.
Mm-hmm. And then since there's a lot of, opposite year, a lot of corn acres go in where soybeans were last year. Same question, what are kind of the keys for corn, or what are you really going to be keeping an eye out there?
Yeah, so corn does have a very friendly demand story. And so, yes, supply can be debated. We can debate what yields are. And at the end of the day, 96 million acres were planted. And so we have a large crop coming, but we've also had pretty robust demand. And so when I look at exports, I mean, USDA had a forecast record for old crop. They're moving that goalpost even higher for new crop. And when you look at the export sales report just came out this morning, when I pulled that up, for the third week of September, we're already 70% ahead same time period a year ago, and over 400 million bushels. And so that's very positive. And so I think the record exports USDA is currently forecast for new crop is going to be achievable, because when you look at the global balance sheet, yes, supply has increased, primarily led by the United States. We're world are consuming more corn. Again, similar to that soybean meal story. It's led by feed, but we're also seeing more ethanol production happen. And so I'm optimistic that Brazil's our primary competitor on the corn export side. They have a lot of ethanol expansion domestically there as well. That's going to eat up a lot of their corn. And I don't think they're going to be able to export at the same pace that they have in the past. It's going to kind of flatline, if you will. And so that presents opportunities for U.S. producers. And then speaking of ethanol production numbers came out yesterday, and there's a lot of positive momentum on the ethanol side as well. So we have California proposed E15. They're the last state that's held out from having that available to their consumers. And so if we get some traction there, that'll eat up another couple 100 million bushels. And then if we get year-round E15 nationwide available, that would also be positive for corn demand. So I do think there's still some optimistic demand around the corner for ethanol as well.
Yep. All right. Very good. I appreciate you having you on here today. And Bree, I would give you the last word, since the whole goal of this podcast, right, is institutional knowledge about making decisions. What are the tools that we can use to get the grain marketed? If you could give advice to a grain farmer, what is that advice? What do you look to? What are the keys to getting that grain marketed?
Well, so I would be paying very close attention to the news. So the top three things I'm paying attention to is South American weather on the soybean side. If there's any sort of hiccup and a weather scare, I would be rewarding those rallies, because we are basically in this kind of sideways pattern until we get a trade deal. Is the number two thing I'm paying attention to. And somebody just texted me that there was a trade deal. So I'm anxious to go look at that, but that will rally the market as well, or influence price one way or the other. And then biofuel demand. So any EPA announcement as it relates to not only what the renewable volume obligations will be, but one thing we didn't talk about was the small refinery exemptions. In EPA's proposal, they recommended having other refiners offset small refinery exemptions, those blending requirements, which is a pivot from prior practice where those gallons essentially were just lost. And so EPA cleaned up all the old small refinery exemptions, but there's this bucket from 2023 onward on what are we going to do for the small refinery exemptions from a biofuel standpoint. So if we get clarity on if those will be made up, that will be a friendly story as well for the market to rally. So I would sit tight, wait for some of these headlines, especially as it relates to soybeans, because that's really what's going to influence these markets. And then corn has a much better kind of demand story as we look to the new year. And so if storage is tight, I would focus on storing what you can for corn in hopes for price rallies in the new year.
All right. Now, you mentioned before, give us one more time the website where we can see some of the work that you're doing with Terrain and see some of those insights that you talked about, Bree.
Yeah, definitely. It's terrainag.com, and our site's very easy to navigate. Most of our articles are 3 minutes to read. Some of the more detailed ones, like I did a biofuel kind of debrief, that's a little bit longer of a read, but we make them very user-friendly. And another thing that we're doing is audio. So be on the lookout for that, because we know, farmers are busy. You're in your truck. You might not have time to sit there and physically read something. And so we're expanding more into audio content as well.
All right. Very nice. The next podcast after listening to this one. I appreciate that. Bree, it's so good to have you on. Thank you. I appreciate the expertise in your time. Okay.
Thank you.
Again, we've been visiting with Bree Baatz with Terrain, a grain and oilseed analyst, on this edition of Grain IQ. Again, if you haven't listened to some of those other episodes as well, some of the insights from the past seasons, past experts that have lent their expertise and to give you some of that knowledge into marketing your grain. Once again, thanks to the Nebraska Soybean Board for partnering in this project in this episode of Grain IQ. Thank you very much for joining us here on this podcast. I'm Chad Moyer.
Grain IQ is a production of the Nebraska Rural Radio Association with support from the Nebraska Soybean Board. It is brought to you in part by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. You can listen to Grain IQ on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or online at ruralradionetwork.com.